For most of its history, Finland did not have a written beginning. There was no ancient book that explained where the people came from, no single story that could be opened and pointed to as the origin of the nation, no heroic chronicle that placed Finland alongside the old civilizations of Europe. What Finland had instead were voices, songs passed from one generation to the next, verses learned by listening rather than reading, stories shaped by repetition, altered slightly each time they were told. They existed in memory, not on paper. For centuries, this was enough. Oral cultures do not need written texts to survive as long as the chain of transmission remains intact. As long as singers sing and listeners remember, stories endure. But by the early 19th century, that chain was breaking. Finland was changing in ways that were subtle but irreversible. Modern schooling spread literacy but weakened memorization. Church authorities discouraged elements of folklore that did not fit Christian doctrine. Younger generations moved away from rural communities and traditional ways of life. What had once been sustained by repetition now faced disappearance through neglect. This kind of loss does not announce itself dramatically. There are no final performances, no clear endings. Songs simply stop being sung. Once that happens, they are gone. A small group of scholars began to notice this. They were not driven by nostalgia, but by a clear understanding of cultural fragility. Oral traditions cannot be reconstructed once they disappear. At best, fragments remain. This was the Finland into which Elias Lönnrot was born in 1802. At the time, Finland was not an independent country. It was a Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire, having passed from Swedish to Russian rule only a few decades earlier. Power still spoke Swedish. Authority spoke Russian. Finnish was the language of everyday life, but rarely the language of prestige. To much of Europe, Finland appeared unfinished. In the 19th century, this mattered deeply. Europe ranked cultures, often unconsciously. Nations with ancient epics, written mythologies, and long literary traditions were seen as historical actors. Those without them were treated as peripheral or incomplete. Germany had the Nibelungenlied, Greece had Homer, Iceland had the sagas, Finland had folk songs that few outside its borders had ever heard. This absence shaped how Finland was perceived. Over time, it also shaped how Finns perceived themselves. Lönnrot did not grow up believing he would solve this problem. He was not a nationalist agitator. He trained as a physician. He approached the world through study and observation rather than politics. His background was modest, and his opportunities were hard-won. Language became his entry point. He was drawn to Finnish not only as a spoken language, but as a carrier of memory. He sensed that within it lived something older than administrations, borders, or empires. At first, his work was careful and limited. He wanted to document what still existed, to listen, record, and preserve. So he travelled. He walked long distances through eastern Finland and Karelia. He stayed in poor conditions. He depended on hospitality. He listened patiently to people who had never expected their songs to matter beyond their own communities. What he encountered was astonishing. Elderly singers who could recite thousands of lines from memory, songs that unfolded slowly, guided by rhythm rather than plot, stories that followed patterns older than written Finnish itself. The world described in these songs was not heroic in the usual sense. Power came from knowledge rather than force. Creation began with words. Wisdom mattered more than conquest. But there was no single story. Each singer carried a version. Each village preserved its own emphasis. Contradictions were not mistakes. They were part of the living system. At some point, realized something unsettling. If he wrote these songs down exactly as he heard them, they would survive only as fragments. Valuable fragments, but fragments nonetheless. They would not form a narrative. They would not speak with a unified voice, and in a Europe that expected epics to look like epics, they would not be taken seriously. This realization forced a choice. He could act only as a collector, or he could attempt something more ambitious. As he compared versions and traced patterns, he began to see recurring figures and shared themes. Characters reappeared under different names. Events echoed across regions: creation, conflict, loss, endurance. Slowly, an idea formed. What if these songs were not isolated remnants, but pieces of a larger whole? What if variation had scattered something that once possessed unity? And what if that unity could be reconstructed? This belief reflected the thinking of his time. 19th century scholars assumed that beneath variation lay origins, that fragmentation was the result of decay, that the task of scholarship was restoration. Lönnrot embraced this assumption. He did not believe he was inventing mythology. He believed he was uncovering it. That belief gave him confidence. It also gave him responsibility. As he continued collecting, he began arranging. He linked episodes. He chose between variants. He shaped sequences that felt coherent. These were not neutral acts, but they were driven by urgency. Without structure, the tradition might be archived. With structure, it might survive. When the Kalevala was published, Finland gained something it had never had before: a written epic. And with it came a question that would never fully disappear. Was the Kalevala discovered, or was it created? Lönnrot understood that this tension could not be resolved cleanly, because sometimes preserving the past requires shaping it, and sometimes shaping it is the only way it survives. To understand what Elias Lönnrot was trying to preserve, it is necessary to understand how the rune songs actually lived. They were not performances in the modern sense. There was no stage, no separation between singer and listener, no expectation of perfect repetition. These songs existed inside everyday life. They were sung while working, while resting, while remembering. The rhythm was slow and deliberate. Lines returned again and again, not because singers forgot them, but because repetition carried meaning. Memory was reinforced through pattern rather than speed. In societies without widespread literacy, memory functions differently. Knowledge is not stored externally, it is carried in the body. Songs are learned through listening, imitation, and long familiarity, not through instruction. For this reason, variation was not a flaw, it was essential. Each singer carried the song slightly differently. Emphasis shifted, details changed, verses expanded or contracted depending on the moment and the listener. The song lived in relationship, not in text. This flexibility allowed the tradition to survive for centuries. The world described in these songs was not distant or symbolic. Nature was alive and intentional. Forests listened. Water remembered. Animals crossed boundaries between the human and the divine. Creation was not a single event. It was an ongoing process. Heroes did not rule through command or violence. They argued, sang, crafted, and endured. Power came from knowledge and patience rather than force. The most prominent figure in many of these songs was Väinämöinen, an ancient singer whose authority came from words themselves. He shaped reality through song and understanding, not through weapons. Ilmarinen was a smith, a figure of craft and labour. He forged objects that held cosmic significance. His power was practical rather than mystical. Lemminkainen, by contrast, was impulsive and emotional. He sought glory, acted recklessly, and suffered the consequences repeatedly. These figures were not moral ideals. They were contradictory, flawed, and often unfinished. That complexity mattered. The songs were not teaching obedience. They were exploring character. But none of this existed as a single narrative. There was no agreed beginning, no definitive ending. no authoritative version. Each singer held fragments, not the whole. This system worked as long as communities remained stable. As long as elders passed songs to younger generations, continuity survived. By the early 19th century, that continuity was under threat. Religious reforms discouraged elements considered pagan. Schools emphasized reading and writing rather than memorization. Economic change pulled people away from rural life. The conditions that sustained rune singing were fading. Lönnrot understood this instinctively. His travels took him increasingly toward regions where tradition remained strongest. Karelia became central to his work, not by accident, but by necessity. Karelia lay at the edge of administrative reach. Its isolation had protected older practices. Lutheran reform arrived later. Central authority was weaker. Here, rune singers still carried long sequences of verse. Some could recite thousands of lines from memory without hesitation. Lönnrot listened carefully. He wrote everything down. He compared versions across villages and regions. He began to see how songs transformed without losing identity. What emerged was both rich and chaotic. Stories overlapped, characters shifted roles, events contradicted one another openly. To a modern folklorist, this complexity is the tradition itself. It reveals how oral cultures adapt, respond, and survive. But Lönnrot was not working with modern assumptions. He lived in a time that sought origins, coherence, and structure. 19th century scholars believed that variation was evidence of decay, that beneath difference lay an original form that had fragmented over time. The task of scholarship was to restore that form. Lönnrot shared this belief sincerely. As he organized his notes, he began arranging the material. He grouped songs by theme. He aligned characters across versions. He constructed sequences that felt natural and continuous to him. He did not invent the characters. He did not invent the themes, but he chose structure. This distinction is crucial. The Kalevala is not a transcription of lived tradition. It is a synthesis. That synthesis required judgment. Which version of a song best reflected the core idea? Which variation fit the emerging narrative? Which contradictions could be resolved without destroying meaning? Every decision shaped the result, and every decision reflected Lönnrot's understanding of what Finland needed. Without coherence, the songs might survive as archival material. With coherence, they could become a shared story. When the first version of the Kalevala appeared in 1835, it did not present itself as final or complete. Lönnrot would revise and expand it later, responding to criticism and new material. This openness mattered. It signaled that the epic was not sacred revelation, but an evolving work. Still, the transformation was irreversible. Once written, the songs no longer depended on memory. They no longer changed through performance. They became fixed. Something was lost in that transition, but something was gained. Preservation required freezing certain elements in place. The alternative was disappearance. Lönnrot accepted that trade-off. His work sits at the boundary between loss and survival. It preserves by reshaping. It stabilizes by transforming. This tension cannot be resolved cleanly, but it explains why the Kalevala matters. It is not simply a record of the past. It is a response to the fear that the past was slipping away. And once that response existed, Finland's relationship to its own memory changed permanently. When the Kalevala entered public life, it did so quietly. There was no declaration that Finland now possessed a national epic. No announcement that a missing foundation had been restored. At first, the book circulated mainly among scholars, linguists, and a small educated audience. Yet its effect was immediate. Readers sensed that this was not simply a collection of folk material. It felt complete in a way the fragments never had. It offered continuity. For the first time, Finland's story did not begin with administration, conquest, or law. It began with creation, with figures who belonged to the land itself rather than to any ruling power. In a country long defined by foreign rule, this shift mattered deeply. The Kalevala suggested that Finland existed before Sweden and before Russia, not politically, but culturally. It implied that Finnish identity had roots that could not be erased by changes in governance. Language was central to this transformation. The Kalevala was written in Finnish at a time when Finnish was still struggling for recognition as a language of culture. Swedish dominated education, literature, and administration. Finnish was often dismissed as crude or unsuitable for serious intellectual work. The epic challenged this view directly. Its language was rich and flexible. Its rhythm carried long narratives without collapsing. It demonstrated that Finnish could sustain complexity, abstraction, and beauty. This mattered far beyond literature. Writers began experimenting more confidently in Finnish. Educators argued that Finnish could and should be used in schools. Linguists intensified efforts to standardize vocabulary and grammar. The Kalevala did not create these movements, but it legitimized them. It provided proof. Outside Finland, the response was equally important. European scholars were intrigued. Here was a northern epic emerging at a moment when nationalism and romanticism were reshaping cultural life across the continent. Here was a people previously regarded as peripheral, presenting a mythology that appeared ancient, coherent, and distinctive. The Kalevala was translated into several languages. It entered academic discussions of comparative mythology. It was placed alongside Homer, the Eddas, and other foundational texts. This recognition carried weight. It suggested that Finland belonged culturally within Europe, not merely as an administrative territory, but as a civilization with its own voice. Inside Finland, however, the Kalevala's influence soon moved beyond scholarship. Artists responded first. Painters began depicting scenes from the epic. Sculptors and illustrators drew on its characters. Later, composers would find in it a deep reservoir of themes and imagery. The Kalevala seeped gradually into public consciousness. It appeared in education, in lectures, in conversations about culture and identity. This process was subtle. The Kalevala did not call for independence. It did not argue against imperial authority. It made no political demands. But it changed how Finns imagined themselves. They were no longer simply subjects of empire. They were inheritors of a story that predated empire. This shift altered the emotional landscape. Cultural confidence grew quietly. Demands for language rights, education reform, and recognition gained moral grounding. They were no longer framed as requests for tolerance. They became claims rooted in continuity. Culture prepared the ground where politics would later follow. Lönnrot observed this transformation with restraint. He did not present himself as a national founder. He resisted attempts to turn the Kalevala into a political symbol. He continued his scholarly work and avoided overt alignment with nationalist movements. This caution was deliberate. Lönnrot understood that once culture becomes instruction, it hardens. Once mythology becomes doctrine, it loses flexibility. The Kalevala's strength lay in its openness. Different readers found different meanings in it. Some emphasized harmony and wisdom. Others focused on struggle and endurance. Some saw it as proof of uniqueness. Others as evidence of belonging. These interpretations did not cancel one another out. They coexisted. This plurality helped the Kalevala endure. It did not demand loyalty. It invited engagement. By the middle of the 19th century, Finland's cultural landscape had changed irreversibly. Finnish was gaining ground as a literary language. Art and literature flourished. The idea of Finland as a nation was no longer abstract. It was being rehearsed culturally long before it could be enacted politically. This rehearsal mattered. When political opportunities eventually emerged, Finland was not starting from nothing. It already possessed shared symbols, references, and narratives. The Kalevala did not dictate what independence should look like, but it made independence imaginable. It allowed Finns to think of themselves as a people with a past worth carrying forward. That imagination would prove essential, because when political change finally arrived, it arrived into a society that had already learned to see itself as more than a province. The foundation had been laid quietly, without proclamations or slogans, not through law, not through force, but through story. As the Kalevala became established in Finnish cultural life, admiration gradually gave way to closer examination. This was inevitable. The more important the epic became, the more people wanted to understand how it had been made. Scholars began returning to Lönnrot's original notebooks. They compared recorded rune songs with the published text. They traced where individual verses originated and how they had been altered. What they found complicated the story that many had assumed. Lönnrot had not simply written down what he heard. He had edited extensively. He combined different versions of the same characters. He rearranged episodes so they would form a continuous narrative. He selected certain variants over others because they fit more clearly into the structure he envisioned. In some cases, verses collected from different regions appeared side by side in a single scene. In others, contradictions between versions were resolved through choice rather than preservation. To modern readers, this raised difficult questions. Was the Kalevala an authentic record of Finnish oral tradition? Or was it a 19th century construction shaped by one man's interpretation? As folklore studies developed into a more formal academic discipline, criticism grew sharper. Later scholars emphasized that variation was not corruption. It was the defining feature of oral culture. In an oral tradition, change is not loss, it is continuity. Songs evolve because they are alive. They adapt to context, audience, and memory. Fixing them into a single written form alters their nature. From this perspective, the Kalevala appeared overly orderly. It imposed coherence where none had existed. It suggested unity where lived tradition had embraced plurality. These critiques were valid, but they were often applied without sufficient attention to historical context. Lönnrot was not working with modern folkloristic assumptions. He belonged to a scholarly tradition that believed variation concealed origins, that behind many versions lay an earlier, purer form that had fragmented over time. This belief was widespread in 19th century Europe. Scholars studying language, mythology, and history all searched for original sources. Lönnrot shared this worldview sincerely. When he assembled the Kalevala, he did not believe he was inventing mythology. He believed he was reconstructing it. That belief shaped every decision he made. This does not erase the editorial nature of his work, but it explains why he acted as he did. It also reveals something deeper about cultural preservation. Preservation is never neutral. Deciding what to save, how to arrange it, and how to present it always reflects values and priorities. Even choosing not to intervene is a choice. The Kalevala makes this process visible. By presenting Finnish mythology as a coherent epic, it encouraged the idea of a unified Finnish past. This unity was culturally powerful. It provided a shared reference point, but it also simplified complexity. Local traditions were absorbed into a national narrative. Regional differences became less visible. Individual singers, many of them elderly and poor, faded into anonymity behind the epic as a whole. This raised ethical questions that later generations would confront. Who owns tradition? Who gets credit? Whose voice becomes representative? As Finnish scholarship matured, researchers began to address these questions directly. They published raw song variants alongside the Kalevala. They documented individual singers and their repertoires. They emphasized the diversity that the epic had streamlined. This did not diminish the Kalevala's importance. Instead, it reframed it. The epic was no longer treated as the tradition itself. It was understood as one powerful interpretation among many. This reframing allowed Finland to hold two truths at the same time. The Kalevala was essential to cultural survival, and it was not definitive. This balance mattered. In many countries, national epics hardened into sacred texts. Questioning them became taboo. Mythology turned into ideology. Finland largely avoided this outcome. Part of the reason was Lönnrot's own attitude. He did not claim divine inspiration. He documented his sources. He revised his work openly. He acknowledged uncertainty. This humility created space for critique. Because the Kalevala was never presented as absolute truth, it could be examined without being destroyed. Debate strengthened the epic rather than weakening it. It reminded Finns that culture is not a monument. It is a process, a conversation carried across generations. The Kalevala survived scrutiny because it could absorb it. It changed as scholarship changed. It gained context as understanding deepened. It remained central without becoming rigid. This flexibility shaped how Finnish identity developed. Instead of enforcing a single definition of belonging, the Kalevala became a shared reference, something people could interpret differently without abandoning it. That distinction is subtle but crucial. A boundary divides, a reference connects. The Kalevala became the latter. By accepting complexity rather than denying it, Finland avoided turning its mythology into a tool of exclusion. The epic remained culturally powerful without becoming politically coercive. This outcome was not guaranteed. It emerged from choices made over decades, from scholars who insisted on nuance, from educators who emphasized context, from artists who reimagined rather than repeated, and from Lönnrot's original refusal to claim final authority. Because he left room for uncertainty, later generations could inhabit the tradition rather than submit to it. This is why the Kalevala continues to matter, not as an unquestioned foundation, but as an evolving inheritance, one that invites engagement rather than obedience. As Finland moved closer to independence, the Kalevala followed in a quiet but persistent way. It did not lead marches. It did not appear in political programs. It was rarely cited directly in speeches. Instead, it worked beneath the surface. By the late 19th century, the Kalevala had become part of the cultural atmosphere. Its language, imagery, and characters were familiar even to people who had never read it closely. It shaped metaphors. It shaped assumptions. It shaped how Finns thought about endurance, struggle, and belonging. This influence was subtle, but it was real. The Kalevala presented a world where power did not come from domination. Authority emerged through knowledge, patience, and the ability to understand forces larger than oneself. Heroes succeeded not by conquering others, but by navigating complexity. This worldview mattered deeply in a country that had spent centuries under stronger powers. Finland's nationalism developed differently from many other movements in Europe. It was cautious rather than expansive, defensive rather than aggressive. Its central concern was survival, not superiority. The Kalevala helped reinforce this orientation. It allowed Finns to imagine themselves as a people with depth and continuity, without imagining themselves as destined rulers over others. It offered dignity without triumphalism. As political consciousness grew, this cultural foundation became increasingly important. Demands for language rights, education reform, and administrative autonomy gained moral weight. They were framed not as rebellion, but as preservation, not as rejection of others, but as protection of something fragile. Culture prepared the ground where politics would later follow. Yet this influence also carried risk. Any powerful symbol can be simplified. Over time, interpretations of the Kalevala became more rigid in some circles. Characters were flattened into archetypes. Themes were reduced to slogans. Complexity gave way to certainty. This tendency became more visible during periods of anxiety. When societies feel threatened, they often search for clear boundaries. Myths that once invited interpretation begin to be treated as answers. Stories that once encouraged reflection become tools for definition. Finland was not immune to this process. At moments, the Kalevala was invoked as proof of who truly belonged. Certain readings emphasized origin and continuity in ways that risked exclusion. The epic's ancient imagery was sometimes treated as evidence rather than metaphor. These interpretations did not represent the whole of Finnish society, but they revealed a recurring tension. Myth can unify, it can also narrow. What prevented this narrowing from becoming dominant in Finland was not the absence of pressure, but the character of the Kalevala itself. The epic resisted simplification. Its heroes were flawed. Its conflicts were unresolved. Its endings were incomplete. There was no single moral arc that could be easily weaponized. No clear victory that justified certainty. No final harmony that erased contradiction. This ambiguity made the Kalevala difficult to turn into rigid ideology. Unlike many national epics elsewhere in Europe, it did not offer a straightforward narrative of destiny or superiority. It portrayed struggle without resolution, wisdom without final authority. This mattered enormously during Finland's most difficult period. The Civil War of 1918 shattered the illusion of unity. Political and social divisions turned violent. Neighbours became enemies. Trust collapsed. In the aftermath, there was a strong temptation to impose simple explanations, to divide history into innocence and guilt, to anchor identity in purity. The Kalevala did not support this impulse. It did not explain why brother fought brother. It did not justify violence. It did not assign clear moral roles. What it offered instead was perspective. It reminded Finns that their inherited story had always been complex, that conflict and contradiction were not foreign intrusions, but part of the human condition reflected in their own mythology. This reminder mattered. It helped prevent the epic from becoming a tool of revenge. It allowed the Kalevala to remain a shared reference rather than a weapon. Over time, the epic settled into a different role. It became cultural infrastructure. It entered education not as doctrine, but as literature. It inspired art rather than law. It shaped imagination more than policy. Composers, painters, writers, and later filmmakers returned to it again and again, not to enforce meaning, but to explore it. This separation between culture and command was crucial. It allowed the Kalevala to remain flexible. It allowed identity to evolve. The epic was respected, but not enforced. Celebrated, but not sanctified. Lönnrot's original restraint echoed through this outcome. By never claiming absolute authority, he left room for reinterpretation. By acknowledging his editorial role, he prevented the Kalevala from becoming untouchable. Later generations benefited from this openness. They could question the epic without rejecting it. They could reinterpret it without destroying it. This balance is rare. In many societies, foundational myths harden over time. They become tests of loyalty. Questioning them is treated as betrayal. Finland largely avoided that fate. The Kalevala remained important without becoming absolute. It could age. It could adapt. It could coexist with change. As Finland entered the modern era, the epic no longer needed to justify existence. The nation was real. The state was established. What remained was meaning. What does it mean to inherit a tradition shaped by interpretation? How does a society honor its past without freezing itself inside it? The Kalevala did not answer these questions. It created space to ask them, and that space mattered. Because identity built on openness can absorb difference. Identity built on certainty cannot. This distinction shaped Finland's cultural resilience in the decades that followed. It explains why the Kalevala remains present without dominating, not as a rulebook, not as a boundary, but as a shared inheritance that continues to invite thought rather than obedience. With time, it becomes tempting to see the Kalevala as inevitable, as if Finland was always meant to have a national epic, as if someone would eventually have gathered the songs, shaped them into a whole, and given the country a written mythology. History is rarely that orderly. The Kalevala exists because one person chose patience over speed, because Elias Lönnrot believed fragments mattered, because he understood that cultural loss rarely announces itself loudly. It happens quietly, one forgotten song at a time. What he preserved was not simply a collection of stories. He preserved a way of seeing the world, a worldview in which power is carried by words rather than force, in which creation begins with song, in which knowledge, memory, and endurance matter more than conquest. That worldview did not remain confined to folklore. As Finland moved through the 20th century, it faced moments that tested its cohesion again and again. Independence brought hope, but also uncertainty. Civil war shattered trust. External pressure forced constant negotiation between survival and principle. Each time, Finland was forced to ask what held it together when institutions faltered. The answer was never simple. It was not race. It was not purity. It was not a single version of history. It was continuity. The Kalevala did not tell Finns what to believe. It reminded them that they belonged to something older than any single crisis. That their identity had been shaped slowly, across generations, rather than created in moments of reaction. This mattered because identity built only on reaction is fragile. Identity rooted in memory can absorb change. Lönnrot did not set out to create nationalism. He did not write manifestos or seek political authority. But by preserving culture, he gave Finland something more durable than slogans. He gave it depth. Depth allows disagreement without collapse. It allows argument without erasure. It allows change without disintegration. That depth also carries responsibility. Once a culture is preserved, it can be used carefully or carelessly. It can open space for curiosity or close ranks around certainty. It can encourage reflection or enforce conformity. The Kalevala has been pulled in all of these directions at different moments in Finnish history. At times, it has inspired openness and creativity. At other times, it has been simplified or selectively interpreted. No cultural artifact remains untouched by the pressures of politics and identity. Yet the Kalevala has endured precisely because it resists reduction. Its heroes are not flawless. Its victories are incomplete. Its world is unresolved. There is no final harmony, no ultimate authority, no simple lesson that can be extracted and imposed. This complexity protects it. It prevents the Kalevala from becoming a single answer to who belongs and who does not. Instead, it remains a question that invites interpretation. That invitation is its strength. It allows the epic to remain relevant without becoming rigid. It can be read differently by different generations without losing its core. This is why the Kalevala still matters. Not as proof of ancient greatness, not as evidence of purity, not as a boundary around identity, but as an example of how culture survives. Lönnrot understood, perhaps intuitively, that preservation requires choice, that memory must be shaped to endure, and that shaping carries ethical weight. He made those choices with restraint, He did not claim final authority. He did not deny uncertainty. He documented his process. He left room for revision. That humility is part of the Kalevala's legacy. By acknowledging his role as editor rather than prophet, Lönnrot ensured that the epic could be questioned without being destroyed. It could be re-examined without being rejected. This openness allowed later generations to inherit the Kalevala without being trapped inside it. They could honor it while still moving forward. In this sense, Lönnrot did more than save Finland's ancient mythology. He demonstrated how a small culture can protect its voice without turning it into dogma, how preservation can coexist with openness, how identity can be rooted without becoming rigid. These lessons remain relevant far beyond Finland. In a world where identity is often reduced to slogans and boundaries, the Kalevala offers a quieter alternative. It shows that belonging does not require certainty. That continuity does not require uniformity. Culture does not need to be pure to be meaningful. It needs to be remembered, questioned, carried forward with care. The Kalevala is not a relic. It is a reminder that nations are shaped not only by laws and borders, but by the stories they choose to preserve, and that sometimes saving the past patiently is the most careful way to prepare for the future.